September 14, 1834, Natchez, Mississippi. A cotton field at dusk where a slave named Isaiah drops his picking sack and stares not at the overseer's whip, but at the plantation owner's 6-year-old son riding past on a pony. The boy's face freezes Isaiah mid-breath, same cleft chin, same widow's peak, same copper-flecked eyes as his own brother Samuel, who vanished from the quarters 3 years prior during a routine sale. But Samuel was never sold, and this child, this white child, shouldn't exist. Isaiah whispers the question that will unravel a conspiracy so depraved it required 5 states, 12 plantations, and the silence of an entire county to survive. Why does young master look exactly like my brother? What Isaiah stumbled upon that evening wasn't just the ugly truth of plantation rape or mixed-race children hidden in plain sight. No, this was something far more calculated, far more monstrous, a breeding program designed not for labor, but for replacement, a system where certain slaves weren't just exploited, they were erased, and their faces worn by white children like masks. Before we go any further into this nightmare, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about antebellum America. If you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about history's most brutal and buried crimes, consider becoming a member. And don't forget to hit that like button. Trust me, you're going to need this community when we're done here. Let me take you back to the deep south of the 1830s, because you have to understand the world Isaiah lived in to grasp the full horror of what he discovered. Natchez, Mississippi wasn't just another cotton town. It was the wealthiest city per capita in the entire United States. The air itself seemed to shimmer with money, the sweet rot of cotton blossoms mixed with the acrid smoke from processing gins. The Mississippi River churning brown and thick just beyond the bluffs, carrying fortunes to New Orleans. Grand mansions lined the high ground, their white columns gleaming like temples, their gardens manicured by hands that were never seen but always working. Below the bluffs, in an area locals called Natchez, under the hill, brothels and gambling houses thrived in perpetual twilight, where riverboat men and slave traders conducted business that polite society pretended didn't exist. But the real business, the business that built those mansions, happened in the fields. Endless fields of cotton stretching to the horizon, worked by thousands of enslaved people who were legally categorized as property, as livestock, as things that could be bought, sold, bred, and disposed of without consequence. The heat was suffocating, especially in September, turning the air into something you had to push through, something that made every breath feel like drowning. And in that heat, under that merciless sun, Isaiah had just seen something that made his blood run colder than the Mississippi in January. Something that told him the true crops being cultivated on Riverside Plantation weren't cotton at all. The man who owned Riverside Plantation was Colonel Marcus Pemberton, and if you'd met him at a Charleston social or a New Orleans auction house, you'd have thought him the very model of Southern gentility. 43 years old, educated at the College of William and Mary, soft-spoken with a preference for French wine and English literature. He wore tailored suits even in the Mississippi heat, kept his graying beard trimmed with precision, and donated generously to the Episcopal Church every Sunday without fail. His wife had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, a tragedy that earned him considerable sympathy among Natchez society, and he was raising their son Michael, alone with what everyone agreed was admirable dedication. Pemberton never raised his voice, never personally wielded a whip, never appeared anything but melancholy and refined. But here's what you need to know about Marcus Pemberton. He kept a leather journal in his study, locked in a drawer behind a false panel, and in that journal he recorded measurements. Heights, weights, bone structures, facial features, blood types before anyone officially knew what blood types were. He was methodical, patient, and he had a partner, Dr. Nathaniel Crough, the plantation's physician, a rail, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that trembled slightly from what he claimed was a war injury, but was actually from laudanum addiction. Crough had been dismissed from 2 teaching hospitals up north for experimental practices that were never fully explained. Together, these 2 men had created something they called the Renewal Project, and Isaiah's brother Samuel had been one of their first subjects. Now, you have to understand how they made this work, because the audacity of it is almost impressive in its evil genius. The official story, the one that satisfied curious neighbors and even Pemberton's own household staff, was that Riverside Plantation participated in something called the Philanthropic Improvement Society. On paper, this was a Charleston-based organization dedicated to improving slave conditions through scientific management and selective breeding for optimal health and labor capacity. Sounds almost progressive for 1834, doesn't it? That's exactly what they wanted you to think. The society published pamphlets, held conferences, even presented papers at agricultural colleges. They argued that by carefully tracking slave health, bloodlines, and physical characteristics, plantation owners could create stronger, more productive workers while simultaneously, and here's the humanitarian hook, reducing infant mortality and improving overall slave welfare. Northern abolitionists hated it but couldn't quite articulate why, because on the surface it seemed to prioritize slave health. Southern planters loved it because it promised increased profits while providing moral cover, and the beauty of this lie was that it contained just enough truth to be believable. Riverside did keep meticulous health records. They did provide better food rations than neighboring plantations. Infant mortality rates were tracked. But all of this was window dressing, bureaucratic camouflage for what was really happening in the plantation's north quarter, in a building everyone called the Nursery, but which no slave was ever allowed to enter after dark. That's where the Philanthropic Improvement Society's true work was conducted. And that's where Samuel had disappeared to, 3 years before Isaiah saw his brother's face on a white child. Let me paint you a picture of the Nursery, because this building was the beating heart of the entire operation. From the outside, it looked like an oversized cabin, whitewashed wood, slate roof, windows with actual glass panes instead of shutters, which alone made it fancier than any slave quarter on the property. It sat isolated on the northern edge of Riverside, separated from the main quarters by about 200 yards of deliberately maintained empty ground, so no one could approach without being seen. 2 doors, one facing the main house, used by Pemberton and Dr. Crough. One facing the fields, used to bring slaves in. But here's the thing, people who went in that field side door at night rarely came out the same way. Sometimes they didn't come out at all. Inside, the building was divided into sections. The front room appeared legitimate medical supplies, examination table, shelves of herbs and tonics, everything a plantation physician might need. But behind a locked door in the back was something else entirely, a surgical theater that would have been sophisticated even by northern hospital standards. Gas lamps for bright light during procedures, a ventilation system that pulled smoke and smell up through a hidden chimney, restraining tables with leather straps worn smooth from use. And here's what made it truly sinister, a second basement level, accessible only through a trapdoor hidden under a Persian rug, where the real records were kept. Not the sanitized health logs shown to visitors, but the actual documentation of what Pemberton and Crough were doing. Ledgers tracking not just slaves but specific genetic traits. Daguerreotype photographs arranged in family trees, and specimen jars, God help me, specimen jars containing tissue samples labeled and dated, stored in alcohol like some grotesque museum collection. This wasn't just a plantation medical facility, it was a laboratory, and the experiments being conducted there required a constant supply of subjects. Of course, people noticed things. You can't run an operation this dark without leaving traces, without creating questions. So let me tell you how they explained away the inconsistencies, because their answers were always just plausible enough to satisfy anyone who didn't look too closely. When slaves disappeared from the quarters, the story was always the same: private sale to a buyer from Texas or Arkansas, territories so distant and records so poorly kept that verification was impossible. Pemberton would even show forged bills of sale if pressed, complete with official-looking seals. When slaves returned from the Nursery altered, walking differently, speaking differently, sometimes not speaking at all, Dr. Crough explained it as recovery from fever or treatment for consumption or, in extreme cases, mental affliction brought on by the strain of field work. The Southern medical establishment of the time had endless diagnoses for slave behavioral changes, most of them rooted in pseudo-scientific racism that blamed the slaves themselves. When family members asked why they couldn't visit their sick relatives in the Nursery, they were told that contagion protocols prevented it, that disease could spread rapidly through the quarters if not contained. This was actually true and had happened on neighboring plantations, so the excuse held water. And when children occasionally appeared in the main house who bore unsettling resemblances to slaves from the quarters, well, that was never discussed directly. The unspoken rule of plantation society was that such observations simply weren't made aloud. Mixed-race children were everywhere in the antebellum South, usually the product of rape, and polite society had developed a collective blindness to them. But what was happening at Riverside went far beyond even that normalized horror. The children in Pemberton's house weren't being hidden or sent away like typical mixed-race offspring. They were being raised as white, and the slaves they resembled weren't their parents. They were their donors. Every conspiracy this size needs foot soldiers, people willing to do the daily dirty work while the architects keep their hands clean. At Riverside, that person was a man named Silas Cord, and I want you to understand exactly what kind of monster he was. Cord served as head overseer, But that title didn't capture the full scope of his role. He was 41 years old, originally from Georgia, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts, one eye slightly higher than the other, a nose that had been broken multiple times, and a mouth that seemed perpetually twisted in something between a smile and a sneer. He was a big man, well over 6 feet, with hands like ham hocks and a reputation for brutality that impressed even other overseers, which is saying something in a world where casual violence was the norm. But Cord wasn't just muscle. He was the logistical genius behind the Renewal Project, the man who identified candidates, who arranged their transfer to the Nursery, who managed the cover stories and falsified the records. He decided which slaves were expendable, which had the physical characteristics Pemberton wanted, which would be missed, and which could vanish without raising too many questions. Pemberton provided the vision and Crough provided the medical expertise, but Cord made it operational. He also served another crucial function. He was the face of conventional plantation discipline, the man who whipped slaves for picking too slow or talking too loud, thereby providing a normal explanation for any screams that might come from the nursery at night. If you heard someone crying out in pain after dark, you assumed Cord was administering punishment for some infraction. You didn't imagine surgery without anesthesia. You didn't imagine what was actually happening, and Cord liked it that way. He liked being feared for the wrong reasons, because it meant no one was looking for the right ones. Now let's talk about the people who suffered through this, because they weren't just anonymous victims, they were real people with names, families, dreams that slavery tried to crush but couldn't quite kill. Isaiah was 26 years old in 1834, born on Riverside, which meant he'd never known freedom, but also meant he knew every inch of that plantation, every pattern in Pemberton's routine, every place a person could hide or a secret could be kept. He worked as a field hand primarily, but he was also skilled at carpentry, which occasionally got him assigned to maintenance work closer to the main house, close enough to observe things other slaves never saw. His brother Samuel had been 3 years younger, with the same dark skin, the same strong build, but with one distinctive feature, those copper, flecked eyes that seemed to catch light like coins at the bottom of a well. Samuel had been clever, too clever maybe, always asking questions about why things were the way they were, always noticing inconsistencies in the overseer's stories. That curiosity had marked him. Then there was Dinah, a 32-year-old woman who worked in the main house as a cook and had a daughter named Ruth, age 7. Dinah had been born in Virginia and sold south when her first owner died, separated from her own mother in the process, a trauma that made her fiercely protective of Ruth, to the point where she'd negotiated with Pemberton to keep Ruth working in the house rather than the fields, where Cord's attention was more constant and more dangerous. There was also a man named Job, 41, who served as the plantation's blacksmith, and who people came to with problems because he was steady, thoughtful, the closest thing to a leader the slave quarters had. These were the people who would ultimately unravel the Renewal Project, but they were also the people most at risk from it, because they paid attention, and on a plantation like Riverside, paying attention could get you killed, or worse. Isaiah wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the nursery on the night of September 22, 1834. That's the detail that haunts me, because if he'd just followed orders, if he'd just stayed in his assigned section of the fields, maybe he'd have lived a longer life. Maybe he'd have never known. But sometimes the truth finds you whether you're looking for it or not. It happened because of a broken plow blade, mundane as that sounds. Isaiah had been sent to the equipment shed near the north quarter to fetch a replacement, a task that should have taken 10 minutes in daylight but took longer in the dark, with only a half moon to see by. He was walking back, carrying the blade over his shoulder, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the usual plantation night, music of insects and distant river traffic. It was a child crying, but muffled, like someone had put a hand over the child's mouth. The sound was coming from the nursery. Now, Isaiah knew the rules. The nursery was forbidden after dark. But that crying had a quality that pulled at something deep in his chest, some instinct that overrode survival logic. He approached carefully, staying low, using the darkness and the empty ground to his advantage. The field side door was slightly ajar. Someone had been careless, and through the gap he could see lamplight and movement. He crept closer, close enough to peer inside, and what he saw made his knees nearly buckle. Dr. Crough was bent over an examination table, working on something Isaiah couldn't quite see. Silas Cord stood nearby, holding a lamp, and on a smaller table against the wall, restrained with leather straps, was a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with skin the color of wet clay and features that made Isaiah's breath catch. The boy looked exactly like Isaiah's cousin Thomas, who'd been sold to Arkansas 2 months earlier. Exactly like him. Same face, same build, same small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall. But this child's skin was somehow lighter, his hair somehow straighter, and he was crying in a way that suggested pain beyond anything Isaiah had experienced in a life full of pain. And then Dr. Crough stepped aside and Isaiah saw what was on the main table, and his mind couldn't process it, refused to process it because what he was seeing couldn't be real, couldn't be happening, couldn't exist in any sane world. Isaiah ran. He doesn't remember deciding to run, his legs just moved, carrying him away from the nursery, away from what he'd seen, his breath coming in ragged gasps that hurt his chest. He made it back to the slave quarters and collapsed outside his cabin, the plow blade clattering on the dirt. And that's where Job found him 20 minutes later, shaking like he had fever, unable to form words. Job got him inside, got him water, and eventually, slowly, haltingly, Isaiah told him what he'd witnessed. And here's the thing about trauma, it fractures your ability to describe reality coherently. Isaiah kept saying, they were making him white, and there was something on the table that looked like Thomas but wasn't Thomas, and I think I saw Samuel, but Samuel was different, Samuel was changed, and none of it made sense even to Isaiah as he said it. Job listened without interrupting, his face growing graver with each detail, and when Isaiah finally fell silent, Job said something that would echo through the coming weeks. If you tell anyone else what you just told me, Cord will hang you for lying. And if you tell the truth, Pemberton will do something worse. Because that was the trap, you see. The horror Isaiah witnessed was so extreme, so beyond the normal bounds of plantation cruelty, that describing it made him sound insane. Who would believe that a respected planter and a licensed physician were doing something that sounded like witchcraft or demonic possession? Slavery was already a system built on gaslighting, on making the enslaved doubt their own perceptions and experiences. This was just a more sophisticated version. For 3 days, Isaiah said nothing to anyone except Job. He worked his shifts, kept his eyes down, tried to convince himself he'd hallucinated or misunderstood. But every time he saw young Master Michael riding past, every time those copper, flecked eyes looked in his direction, Isaiah knew what he'd seen was real, and he knew that if he didn't do something, more people would disappear into the nursery, more faces would be stolen, more brothers would be erased. What happened next is important, because it shows you how the system protected itself even when cracks started to show. Isaiah did eventually speak up, not directly to white authorities, because that would have been suicide, but to Dinah, who as a house servant had access to visitors and the ear of certain white women who sometimes visited Riverside. One of those women, a Quaker from Pennsylvania named Margaret Finch, who was visiting her sister in Natchez, heard secondhand about strange medical practices at Riverside and, to her credit, insisted on raising concerns with the county sheriff on October 3, 1834. Sheriff William Talmadge visited Riverside Plantation to investigate complaints of unnatural acts involving slave property. Let me tell you what that investigation looked like. Talmadge arrived mid-morning, announced in advance so Pemberton had hours to prepare. He was shown into the main house, offered bourbon and cigars, and engaged in pleasant conversation about cotton prices and river traffic for nearly an hour before the subject of the complaint even came up. When it did, Pemberton expressed shock and sadness that someone would make such accusations, implied it was probably the work of an abolitionist agitator, trying to stir up trouble, and then graciously offered to show Talmadge around the property to demonstrate that everything was above board. They toured the fields, the slave quarters, and yes, the nursery. By the time they arrived there, the place was pristine, medical supplies neatly organized, examination table spotless, the back room, if Talmadge even knew to ask about a back room, locked tight with Pemberton explaining it contained expensive surgical instruments too valuable to risk theft or damage. Dr. Crough, looking every inch the respectable physician, showed Talmadge the health logs, explained the Philanthropic Improvement Society's mission, even introduced Talmadge to a few slaves who'd recently received treatment, and who testified, with Cord standing right there, hand on his whip, that they'd been well cared for. Talmadge left satisfied. His official report stated that no evidence of improper conduct was found, and that the complaints appeared to stem from the natural Negro tendency towards superstition and false testimony. Case closed. And Isaiah, watching from the fields as the sheriff rode away, felt something inside him break. But here's the thing about horror this big: you can hide the process, but you can't hide all the results. There were people walking around Riverside Plantation who were living evidence of what was happening in the nursery. If you knew what to look for, if you paid attention, Job started documenting them quietly, carefully, using a system of marks on his blacksmith shed wall that looked like inventory tallies, but were actually tracking something else entirely. There was Marcus, a field hand who'd gone into the nursery with a severe limp and come out 3 weeks later walking normally, except now he rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice sounded hollow, and his eyes had a vacant quality like he was looking at the world through frosted glass. There was Sarah, who'd been pregnant when she was taken in for treatment, and returned no longer pregnant but with no infant and no explanation, walking like someone who'd forgotten how her own body moved, flinching at shadows. Most disturbing was a boy named Peter, about 12 years old, who'd been dark as midnight before his week in the nursery, and came back with patches of lighter skin spreading across his arms and face like some kind of progressive disease. His hair texture changed in places, his very features seeming to shift over the following weeks. None of them would talk about what happened inside. Some couldn't, they'd lost the capacity for complex speech. Others were too terrified, because court had made it clear that discussing nursery procedures would result in punishment that made a whipping look merciful. But their bodies told stories their mouths couldn't. Isaiah cataloged every detail, because he understood now what he'd witnessed that night. The nursery wasn't just taking people apart. It was trying to put them back together as something else. The copper-eyed child who looked like Samuel wasn't wearing his brother's face as a mask. He was Samuel, remade, transformed through some process that violated every natural law Isaiah understood. And if that was possible, if they could do that, then how many others had already been changed? How many white children in Natchez and beyond were actually stolen slaves, their very identities erased, their families never knowing that the person they'd lost was still alive but completely unreachable? Now, this is where the story gets truly chilling, because we need to understand what Pemberton and Crough were actually attempting. I want you to picture this. Dr. Nathaniel Crough had studied in Edinburgh in the 1810s, at a time when anatomists were buying bodies from grave robbers and conducting experiments that would make modern ethics boards burn their research notes. He'd become obsessed with something he called humoral transformation, a bastardized fusion of ancient medicine and contemporary racial pseudo-science. Crough believed that racial characteristics weren't fixed, but were the result of specific fluids and tissues in the body, and that by removing, replacing, or treating these components, you could literally change a person's race. It sounds insane, and it was insane, but you have to understand that 1830s medical science was still debating whether different races were even the same species. This was the era of phrenology, of scientific racism trying to justify slavery through measurement and classification. Pemberton brought the money and the subjects, Crough brought the methodology. They started with small changes, skin treatments using compounds of mercury, arsenic, and God knows what else, applied over weeks to gradually lighten pigmentation, hair texture altered through chemical processes, and horrifyingly, through actual follicle removal and replacement using techniques adapted from burn victim treatment. Facial features modified through a combination of dietary manipulation in young subjects whose bones were still growing, strategic scaring to reshape tissue, and in extreme cases, early experiments with what we'd now call plastic surgery, crude, agonizing procedures performed without proper anesthesia beyond alcohol and laudanum. The journals that would later be recovered described it all in clinical detail. Subject 17 showed 23% pigmentation reduction after 6 weeks of treatment protocol. Facial restructuring proceeding adequately, though subject expired before completion. They were creating white children from slave children, and when the children didn't survive, which was often, they simply selected new subjects and refined their methods. And the ones who did survive, they were adopted out through a network of collaborating families, given new names, new histories, raised as white in cities far from Natchez where no one would recognize them. It was genocide through transformation, a way to literally erase black people from existence while keeping their bodies alive. The ultimate cruelty. The man who would ultimately bring down the Renewal Project was named Robert Shaw, though that's not the name you'll find in most history books, because the truth of what he did was largely erased by people who wanted this story buried. Shaw was a Methodist circuit preacher, 34 years old, originally from Connecticut but working the Mississippi Territory because he'd developed a reputation, not entirely fair but not entirely wrong, for being too sympathetic to slaves, too willing to suggest that maybe their souls were equal to white souls, too prone to asking uncomfortable questions about whether a system that treated humans as property could ever be Christian. He was tall, lean to the point of gaunt, with dark hair going prematurely gray and eyes that people described as burning when he got passionate about something, which was often. Shaw had a personal stake in this fight, though he didn't know it yet. His younger sister, Elizabeth, had married a plantation owner in Louisiana 3 years prior, and she'd written him letters that had grown increasingly strange, talking about a medical society her husband had joined, about children who looked unsettlingly familiar, about things that didn't add up but which she couldn't quite articulate. Then the letters stopped. When Shaw traveled to Louisiana to check on her, he was told Elizabeth had died of yellow fever and was already buried. No body to view. No chance to say goodbye. Something about it felt wrong, felt staged, but he had no proof and no standing to push the issue. So he'd thrown himself into his preaching with even more intensity, traveling from plantation to plantation, holding services for slaves and white families alike, watching, listening, documenting. And on October 15, 1834, his circuit brought him to Riverside Plantation, where Marcus Pemberton, always eager to appear pious, insisted the good Reverend stay for supper and hold an evening service for the household. Shaw accepted. And that night, during the service, he noticed a 6-year-old boy sitting next to Pemberton, young Master Michael, and something about the child's face made Shaw's breath catch, though he couldn't say why until later, when he was lying in the guest room, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out why that copper-eyed boy looked exactly like the slave he'd baptized in Georgia 2 years ago. Shaw did something incredibly dangerous. He extended his stay at Riverside, told Pemberton he was inspired by the plantation's operation, wanted to observe their enlightened approach to slave management, suggested he might write about it for church publications up north as an example of how Christianity and agriculture could coexist harmoniously. Pemberton, flattered and seeing an opportunity for positive publicity, agreed enthusiastically. This gave Shaw access. Over the next 2 weeks, he moved through Riverside with the unique freedom of a white man who nobody suspected, conducting services, counseling slaves, offering blessings, and asking questions that sounded innocent but were carefully designed to map the plantation's secrets. He noticed patterns. Certain slaves were never available for evening services because they were working late or recovering from illness. The nursery was always locked when he walked past, even during daytime hours when a legitimate medical facility should be accessible. Dr. Crough avoided him, and when they did interact, the doctor seemed nervous, eager to end conversations quickly. And Shaw began receiving messages, nothing overt, nothing that could be traced, but small things. A hymnal returned to his room with a certain page marked, a flower left on his windowsill, a species that only grew near the north quarter. A child who tugged his sleeve during a service and whispered, "My brother is in the ground but also in the house," before running off. The slaves were trying to tell him something. One night Shaw did something that took either courage or madness. He prayed with Job at the blacksmith shed, and during that prayer, with cord far enough away at the main house, Job told him everything. Every disappearance, every altered victim, every suspicion about the nursery. And he told him about Isaiah's eyewitness account, about the boy who looked like Thomas, about the process they suspected but couldn't prove. Shaw listened without interrupting, his face growing paler as the story unfolded, and when Job finished, Shaw said quietly, "I need to see inside that building." Job shook his head. "If they catch you, they'll kill you. White preacher or not." Shaw's response was simple, "Then let's make sure they don't catch me. I need to pause here for a moment and ask you something directly. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns from disturbing to absolutely nightmarish, where we stop talking about suspicions and theories and start confronting hard evidence of crimes so monstrous they challenge your faith in humanity." What Shaw was about to discover in that building would haunt him for the rest of his life, and it should haunt us too. Because this isn't just history, it's a warning. If you're still watching, if you haven't clicked away because this is too much, then you're exactly the kind of person who needs to hear this story all the way through. Drop a comment right now, just one word, any word, so I know you're still here, so I know I'm not telling this to the void. Because what happened next at Riverside Plantation matters. It matters that we remember. It matters that we bear witness, even under 90 years later, to what humans are capable of doing to each other when they decide certain lives don't count as lives at all. Hit that like button if you're with me. Share this video if you think other people need to know this story, and steel yourself because we're about to walk into the nursery. October 29, 1834, at approximately 2 in the morning, Shaw moved through the darkness of Riverside Plantation like a ghost, guided by Isaiah who knew every patrol pattern, every moment when cord would be elsewhere, every shadow deep enough to hide in. They reached the nursery and found what Job had promised, a side window that could be jimmied open if you knew exactly where to apply pressure, a flaw in the construction that had never been fixed, because who would dare try to break into the place everyone feared? Shaw went in alone. Isaiah couldn't. The risk was too great for a slave to be caught anywhere near there, so he kept watch outside, every muscle tensed, ready to signal if anyone approached. Inside, Shaw lit a small candle, shielding the flame with his hand, and began to search. The front room looked exactly as Sheriff Talmadge had seen it, legitimate, organized, unremarkable. But Shaw found the back room door and, using a knife, worked the lock until it gave way. What he saw in that back room confirmed everything Job had told him and added layers of horror Job hadn't known. The surgical theater with its restraining tables. The ventilation system still carrying the faint smell of chemicals and something else. Something organic and rotten. The shelves of compounds with handwritten labels, pigmentation inhibitor, follicle treatment solution, bone density enhancer. And then he found the trapdoor, pulled it open, descended into the basement level, his candle casting wreathing shadows on stone walls. Down there Shaw found the journals, 3 years' worth of meticulous records documenting 73 subjects, 73 slaves who'd entered the nursery for treatment. Some marked complete, some partial success, some expired during process. Each entry included a daguerreotype photograph, before and after images that showed the progression of transformation. Shaw saw children who started dark-skinned and ended pale, adults who began with clearly African features and ended with European ones, and he saw names Samuel Thomas and dozens more. But the most damning evidence was what Shaw found in the specimen jars, preserved tissue samples labeled with 2 names each, the original slave name and the new white identity. Proof that these children were still alive somewhere, wearing stolen faces, living stolen lives. Shaw knew in that moment he wasn't just looking at murder. Murder would have been simpler. This was something worse: a systematic identity erasure, the complete annihilation of a person while keeping their body alive and functional for someone else's use. He began photographing pages with a portable daguerreotype device he'd brought, working as quickly as possible, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the journals twice. Shaw was halfway through documenting the journals when Isaiah hissed a warning from outside: someone was coming. Shaw extinguished his candle instantly, plunging the basement into absolute darkness, his heart hammering so hard he was sure it would give him away. Above him he heard the nursery's front door open, heard footsteps, heard Dr. Crough's voice saying to someone, "I'll just be a moment, need to check on the specimens." Shaw had maybe 30 seconds before Crough discovered the open trapdoor. He made a decision that probably saved his life. Instead of trying to escape up and out, he grabbed 2 of the journals, stuffed them inside his coat, and moved deeper into the basement where he'd noticed another passage, probably a root cellar entrance leading outside. He found it by feel, a wooden door so old and warped it barely fit its frame anymore. He pushed through just as he heard Crough descending into the basement behind him, and then Shaw was outside, crawling through dirt and darkness, emerging in a small depression about 20 yards from the nursery's north wall. Isaiah found him there moments later, and together they ran, not toward the slave quarters, too obvious, but toward the river, toward the thick undergrowth along the bank where they could disappear. Behind them, a bell began ringing. Cord's voice bellowed across the plantation, "Intruder! Everyone up, search the grounds." Shaw and Isaiah crashed through the brush, mosquitoes swarming them, branches tearing at their clothes and skin. They could hear dogs. Cord kept bloodhounds specifically for tracking runaway slaves. The animals' baying grew closer, a sound that made Isaiah's breathing turn ragged with panic, because he knew what those dogs did to the people they caught. Shaw pulled him into the river, into the Mississippi's muddy water, and they waded along the shallows, trying to mask their scent. The current was stronger than Shaw expected. Twice he nearly lost his footing, nearly lost the journals tucked against his chest. They moved downstream for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, until the sounds of pursuit faded, until they could risk climbing out onto a sandbar in the pre-dawn darkness. Shaw checked the journals, waterlogged but readable, the photographs smeared but still showing enough to prove what he'd seen. Isaiah looked at him with eyes that held both hope and terror, and asked the question that mattered most: will anyone believe us? Shaw and Isaiah made it to Natchez proper by sunrise, exhausted, filthy, with Shaw looking like he'd been dragged behind a horse, and Isaiah knowing that every white person who saw him, a slave without a pass out of bounds, was a potential threat. Shaw went directly to the office of Thomas Mayfield, the district prosecutor, a man Shaw had met at social functions and believed to be relatively honest by Mississippi standards. He burst into Mayfield's office at 7 in the morning, threw the waterlogged journals on the man's desk, and said, "Marcus Pemberton is conducting medical experiments on slaves. He's been altering their race and identity for years. This is the proof." Mayfield looked at Shaw like he'd lost his mind. But he opened the journals. He saw the photographs, the meticulous records, the specimen labels. His face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and then something else. Something that made Shaw's stomach drop. "Reverend Shaw," Mayfield said slowly, "where exactly did you obtain these materials?" And Shaw suddenly understood the trap he'd walked into. He'd stolen property from a private plantation. He'd trespassed. He'd entered a locked building without permission. And his only witness was a slave, whose testimony was inadmissible in court. Meanwhile, Pemberton would argue that these journals were falsified, that Shaw had created them to slander a respected planter. that this was an abolitionist plot. "These are clearly fabrications," Mayfield said, sliding the journals back across his desk. "Fantastical claims designed to incite violence against legitimate agricultural operations. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Reverend, and I strongly suggest you leave Natchez entirely before Colonel Pemberton decides to press charges for theft and slander." Shaw stood there, dumbstruck. He had the evidence, he had the proof, and none of it mattered because the system was designed to protect men like Pemberton, designed to render crimes against slaves invisible, designed to make truth impossible. "What about the children?" Shaw's voice cracked. "What about the 73 people documented in those journals?" Mayfield stood. "Get out of my office." Outside, Isaiah was waiting in an alley, and when he saw Shaw's face, he knew. "They won't help," Isaiah said. It wasn't a question. Shaw shook his head, rage and despair warring in his chest. And Isaiah said something that changed everything. "Then we do this ourselves." What Isaiah proposed was insane, illegal, and absolutely necessary. They would force the truth into the light by making it impossible to ignore. Over the next week, Shaw and a small group of trusted allies, Job, Dinah, a few free black men from Natchez, under the Hill, and 2 white abolitionists who'd come down from Cincinnati, planned something unprecedented. They would raid the nursery themselves, document everything, and release the information simultaneously to newspapers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, creating enough public outrage that Mississippi authorities would have no choice but to investigate. On November 6, 1834, they moved. Shaw and his team approached the nursery at midnight, using keys that Dinah had stolen from Pemberton's study during her housework. They were armed not with guns, which would have been suicide, but with crowbars, hammers, tools that could break locks and pry open sealed doors. They went in expecting to find evidence. What they found was an active crime scene. In the surgical theater, Dr. Crough was in the middle of a procedure on a young girl, maybe 8 years old, who was strapped to the table and unconscious from ether. Her skin had been partially peeled back from her face. God help me for having to describe this, in preparation for what Crough's notes would later describe as facial restructuring via tissue grafting. The moment they burst in, Crough spun around, scalpel still in hand, his face showing not fear but annoyance at the interruption. "You're killing her?" Shaw said, his voice barely audible. Crough shook his head. "I'm improving her, making her valuable, making her human." And in that moment, Shaw understood the full depth of the evil they were confronting. Crough genuinely believed he was doing good, that transforming black children into white children was a form of salvation. They restrained Crough, stopped the procedure, got the girl medical attention. Then they went to the basement and found 17 people in various stages of treatment. Some recently arrived, some who'd been there for weeks, all in conditions that would later be described in newspaper accounts as resembling a medieval torture chamber more than any legitimate medical facility. They found the complete archives, all 6 years of journals, over 200 daguerreotypes, correspondence with a network of collaborating physicians and plantation owners across 5 states, financial records showing thousands of dollars changing hands for successfully transformed subjects. This wasn't one madman's experiment. It was an organized system, a market, a business. When law enforcement finally arrived, forced to respond because Shaw had made sure 2 newspaper reporters from New Orleans were present during the raid, they found Marcus Pemberton in his study, calmly burning papers in the fireplace. He was arrested without resistance, maintaining throughout that he'd had no knowledge of Dr. Crough's unauthorized activities, that he'd been deceived by a trusted employee. But the journals told a different story. Pemberton, it turned out, wasn't just a wealthy planter who'd enabled medical atrocities. He was the architect of an ideology. His personal writings, recovered from a safe in his bedroom, laid out a complete philosophy. Slavery was inefficient, he argued, because it maintained a visible underclass that generated sympathy and abolitionist sentiment. Better to eliminate that underclass entirely, to transform promising slave children into white citizens who would never know their origins, never identify with their race, never threaten the social order. It was slavery's final solution, a way to destroy black identity without the mess of mass murder. Dr. Nathaniel Crough's history was even darker. Investigators discovered he'd been expelled from medical school in Pennsylvania not for incompetence, but for experimenting on Irish immigrant patients without consent, attempting early versions of racial transformation based on his obsession with proving that race was mutable. He'd fled to Mississippi where regulations were looser and human subjects more available. And Silas Cord was found trying to escape to Texas with a satchel full of gold coins and a list of names, other plantations, other physicians, other participants in the Renewal Project network. He was captured 3 miles from the Louisiana border and, faced with hanging, began to talk. The network he described was staggering: 23 plantations across Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, all participating in various forms of identity erasure experiments. Some used the Pemberton-Crough methodology, others were developing their own techniques. Conservative estimates suggested over 400 slaves had been subjected to transformation attempts, with a survival rate of roughly 40%. That meant at least 160 white children in the South were actually transformed slaves, living with families who either knew the truth and didn't care or had been deceived by adoption agencies that specialized in this particular horror. As investigators dug deeper, following the threads that Cord provided and cross-referencing Pemberton's correspondence, the true scope of the Renewal Project emerged, and it was so much worse than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just a Southern problem. The network had connections to physicians in London who were conducting similar experiments on Irish and Romani children, to colonial operations in the Caribbean where indigenous people were being subjected to improvement programs, to academic institutions in France and Germany where racial pseudoscience was developing the theoretical framework for identity erasure. Pemberton had been corresponding with European scientists, sharing data, comparing methodologies. There was talk in these letters of perfecting the process and scaling up operations, with the ultimate goal of systematically eliminating inferior races through transformation rather than extermination. The financial infrastructure supporting this was equally disturbing. A private bank in New Orleans, established specifically to handle Renewal Project funds, had processed over $400,000 in transactions related to transformed children, adoption fees, medical expenses, payments to collaborating families. Wealthy families in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York had adopted orphans. From the South, children with vague backstories about deceased parents and convenient lack of records, never suspecting that these children had parents who were still alive, still enslaved, still grieving the loss of children who weren't actually dead. Some of the children had become prominent: a banker's son in Charleston, a merchant's daughter in Savannah, even a young man enrolled at Harvard who distinguished himself in classical studies and had no idea he'd been born into slavery in Mississippi. The question of what to do about these children, now ranging from 6 to 14 years old, with no memory of their original identities, fully acculturated to white society, became a legal and ethical nightmare that courts would struggle with for years. Could you undo the transformation? Should you? Who were these children really? The questions had no good answers, only tragic ones. Here's the part that should make your blood run cold. Significant portions of Southern society knew something was happening and chose not to look too closely. The conspiracy of silence around the Renewal Project wasn't just about fear or ignorance. It was active, intentional suppression. Newspaper editors in Mississippi and Louisiana received advance copies of investigative reports from Northern papers, but chose not to run them, claiming they were inflammatory propaganda. Church leaders preached sermons suggesting that the real crime was Northern interference in Southern affairs, not the transformation of children. Politicians introduced legislation to criminalize the distribution of abolitionist materials that discussed the Renewal Project, framing it as protecting Southern honor. Even some abolitionists were conflicted, worried that the story was so extreme it would damage their credibility, that people would dismiss it as impossible exaggeration and by extension dismiss all claims about slavery's brutality. The silence was enforced through multiple mechanisms: economic pressure on anyone who spoke too loudly, social ostracism, and outright violence. Perhaps most insidiously, there was a cultural narrative that developed claiming the entire thing had been exaggerated, that while some improper medical practices occurred, the scale and horror had been inflated by abolitionist activists for political purposes. This narrative, that the victims and whistleblowers were lying or exaggerating, gained traction because it was more comfortable than confronting the truth. People wanted to believe it wasn't that bad, that their society wasn't capable of such systematic evil, that the world still made sense. So they convinced themselves that the evidence was falsified, that the photographs were staged, that the testimony was unreliable. And many of those people's descendants still believe it today, still insist that the Renewal Project was either a hoax or a minor incident blown out of proportion, because accepting the truth would require accepting that the foundation of their family's wealth and status was built on something unspeakable. Justice, such as it was, came slowly and incompletely. Dr. Nathaniel Crough was tried in federal court. Mississippi courts refused to prosecute, and convicted of multiple counts of assault and false imprisonment. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison but served only 7 before dying of tuberculosis in 1841, maintaining until his last breath that he'd been a pioneer of medical science whose work would someday be vindicated. He expressed no remorse for the lives he'd destroyed, only regret that he hadn't been able to complete his research. Silas Cord faced charges in Mississippi State Court for conspiracy and abuse of slave property. Notably, he wasn't charged with crimes against people but with property damage. He was convicted and sentenced to hang, but the sentence was commuted to life in prison by Governor Hiram Runnels, who'd received significant political donations from Pemberton's family. Cord served 13 years before being quietly pardoned in 1847 and disappearing into Texas territory, where some reports suggest he continued working as an overseer under an assumed name. Marcus Pemberton never faced trial. His attorneys argued successfully that he'd been deceived by Crough, that as a gentleman planter he couldn't be expected to personally oversee every medical procedure, that he'd trusted his physician to act ethically. The journals clearly contradicting this claim were ruled inadmissible on technical grounds. Pemberton was socially ruined, forced to sell Riverside Plantation, shunned by former associates, but he retained most of his wealth and lived comfortably in Mobile, Alabama until his death in 1856. His son, young Michael, was raised by distant relatives who changed his name and moved him to Texas, where he grew up believing he was white, married a white woman, had children, and died in 1889 never knowing his true identity. As for the transformed children scattered across the country, efforts to identify and locate them proved nearly impossible. Many families refused to cooperate, denying any connection to the scandal. Some children were told the truth and had complete psychological breakdowns, unable to reconcile their lived identity with their biological origins. Others were never told and lived their entire lives as white people, meaning there are people alive today who are descendants of Renewal Project victims and have no idea of their family history. The legacy of the Renewal Project extends far beyond the specific crimes committed at Riverside Plantation. It revealed the ultimate logic of slavery. If human beings can be property, if their bodies can be bought and sold, then what prevents their complete consumption, their total erasure? The answer is nothing prevents it. Slavery was never just about forced labor. It was about the complete annihilation of personhood, and the Renewal Project was simply the most literal expression of that principle. But here's what haunts me most about this story. What should haunt all of us: the people who perpetrated these crimes weren't monsters in any obvious sense. They were respected members of society, educated, cultured, religious. Pemberton donated to churches. Crough had medical credentials. They existed within a system that had already decided certain lives were expendable, and they simply took that logic to its conclusion. The real horror isn't that evil people do evil things, it's that normal people, living in evil systems, can convince themselves that unspeakable acts are reasonable, even beneficial. And that's the lesson we need to carry forward. Systems matter. The structure of society, the laws we create, the assumptions we normalize, these things shape what becomes possible, what becomes acceptable. The Renewal Project could exist because slavery created the conditions where black bodies were seen as raw materials, as things that could be used, modified, and disposed of at will. Every person who benefited from slavery, every person who defended it or ignored it, was complicit in creating the world where the Renewal Project was possible. That includes the Northerners who bought transformed children, the politicians who protected the system, the citizens who chose comfort over confrontation. Evil doesn't usually announce itself with horns and pitchforks. It wears respectable clothes, speaks in measured tones, and justifies itself with science and economics and tradition, and it persists because most people would rather look away than confront what they benefit from. That's the moral here. Looking away is participation. Silence is complicity. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we looking away from right now? What systems are we participating in that future generations will judge as harshly as we judge slavery? Robert Shaw spent the rest of his life advocating for abolition, using the Renewal Project as evidence that slavery would inevitably lead to the complete destruction of black humanity. He published a memoir in 1845 that was widely read in the North and contributed to growing anti-slavery sentiment. He never found his sister Elizabeth, but he suspected, though could never prove, that she'd discovered her husband's involvement in a similar operation and had been killed to keep her quiet. Isaiah made it north through the Underground Railroad and lived in Boston, working as a carpenter and speaking at abolitionist meetings, always careful to use a pseudonym, because he knew there were people who'd kill him to silence the truth about what he'd witnessed. He died in 1867, a free man, never knowing what happened to his brother Samuel or whether Samuel's consciousness survived the transformation in any meaningful way. So let me ask you this: could something like the Renewal Project happen today? Not the specific methodology. Obviously, medical science has advanced, ethics boards exist, laws protect human subjects, but the underlying logic, the desire to erase certain identities, to remake people into something more acceptable, more profitable, more convenient, is that really gone? Think about forced assimilation programs. Think about medical experimentation on marginalized communities. Think about how certain bodies are still treated as disposable, certain lives as less valuable. The methods change, but the question remains: who counts as fully human? Who deserves to exist as themselves? I want you to comment below with your thoughts, not just about this story, but about what it means for us now. What are the modern equivalents? Where do we see echoes of this horror? And what are we going to do about it? Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And next week, we're diving into another buried chapter of American history, one that involves a children's hospital in Philadelphia, a mysterious epidemic of sleeping sickness, and discoveries that would lead to congressional hearings and destroyed careers. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and the question of what happens when the institutions meant to protect us are the ones doing the harm. You won't want to miss it.